Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club Financial Edition. And today we're continuing our reading of The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. This is the fifth edition. Oh, here. And the subtitle is called Second Look at the Federal Reserve. And I hope you guys are enjoying this so far. This is a very thick book, but I think we're halfway through. So kudos to you guys who's been sticking with us all this time. And since you're here after the video, you could check out our other book clubs. We have the spiritual book clubs on Mondays, health book clubs on Wednesdays, and of course, Thursdays, we have the financial book club. And we have newsletters that we put out once a month. So you can keep up with what we're up to and some new stuff, new videos, new announcements. We also have podcasts where we interview, interesting people once in a while. So you could find all that on our website. And so check out our YouTube channel as well. All our books that we've read, we put it up on there, so you could check those out. And check out our merch to support us there if you find these videos helpful. Um, and also, if you're local in the LA, Los Angeles area, come visit us in our healing center in person. We'd love to see you in person. We use scalar technologies based on Nikola Tesla's scalar wave research for holistic healing. So, all right. So you could find all that on our website and check those out. Okay, so this is chapter 17, and this will be part 1. Chapter 17, A Den of Vipers. The story of the Second Bank of the United States, the nation's third central bank, the election of Andrew Jackson on an anti-bank platform, the battle between President Jackson and the head of the bank, Nicholas Biddle, the deliberate creation of a depression to frighten the public into keeping the bank, Jackson's ultimate victory. The monetary chaos that existed at the end of 1812, at the end of the War of 1812, outlined in the previous chapter, was caused by an almost universal fraud within the banking industry. Depositors in good faith placed their gold and silver into banks for safekeeping and for the convenience of using paper money in their everyday transactions. The banks in turn promised them they could exchange the paper for their coins whenever they wished. At the same time, however, through the mechanism of fractional reserve banking, paper money was created far in excess of the value of the coins held in reserve. Since the new money had just as much claim to the coins as the old, the bankers knew that if a sizable percentage of their customers were to request a withdrawal of their coins, that solemn promise simply could not be kept. This, in fact, is precisely what happened over and over again during that period. By 1814, Thomas Jefferson had retired to Monticello and had bitterly resigned himself to defeat on the issue of money. In a letter to John Adams, he said, I have ever been the enemy of banks, not of those discounting for cash, that is, charging interest on loans of real money, but of those foisting their own paper into circulation and thus banishing our cash. My zeal against those institutions was so warm and open at the establishment of the Bank of the U.S. that I was derided as a maniac by the tribe of bankmongers who were seeking to filch from the public their swindling and barren gains. Shall we build an altar to the old paper money of the Revolution, which ruined individuals but saved the Republic, and burn on that all the bank charters, present and future? And their notes with them, for these are to ruin both republic and individuals. This cannot be done. The mania is too strong. It has seized by its delusions and corruptions all the members of our governments, general, special, and individual. And that quote was from Lester J. Capon. Editor, the Adams Jefferson Letters, New York Simon and Schuster, 1971, Volume 2, page 424. Jefferson was right. Congress had neither the wisdom nor the courage to let the free market clean up the mess that remained after the demise of the first bank of the U.S. If it had, the fraud soon would have become understood by the public, the dishonest banks would have folded, the losses would have been taken, and the suffering would have been ended, perhaps forever. Instead, Congress moved to protect the banks, to organize the fraud, and to perpetuate the losses. All of this was accomplished in 1816 when a 20-year charter was given to the second Bank of the United States. The second, the second Bank of the United States. In every respect, the new bank was a carbon copy of the old, with one minor exception. Congress unashamedly extracted from the private investors what amounted to nothing less than a bribe in the form of $1.5 million, quote, in consideration of the exclusive privileges and benefits conferred by this act, end quote. And that was from Act of 1816, Section 23, Stat at 191. The bankers were glad to pay the fee, not only because it was a modest price for such a profitable enterprise, but also because, as before, they received an immediate government deposit of 1/5 the total capitalization, which then was used as the base for manufacturing much of the remaining startup capital. The charter required the bank to raise a minimum of $7 million in specie. But even in its second year of operation, its specie never rose above 2.5 million. And that footnote was from Rothbard, Mystery, page 203. Once again, the monetary and political scientists had carved out their profitable niches, and the gullible taxpayer, his head filled with sweet visions of banking reform, was left to pick up the tab. Another important continuity between the old and the new bank was the concentration of foreign investments. In fact, the largest single block of stock in the new bank, about 1/3 in all, was held by this group. And that note was from Cruz, page 25. It is certainly no exaggeration to say that the second bank of the United States was rooted as deeply in Britain as it was in America. The nation's third central bank ran into deep trouble from the start. It had promised to continue the tradition of moderating the other banks by refusing to accept any of their notes unless they were redeemable in specie on demand. But when the other banks returned the gesture and required that the new bank also pay out specie on their demand, it frequently lost its resolve. There was also the tiny matter of corruption. As the bank's major historian writes, quote, so many influential people were interested in the state banks as stockholders that it was not advisable to give offense by demanding payment in specie, and borrowers were anxious to keep banks in the humor to lend. And that quote was from Ralph C.H. Catterall, The Second Bank of the United States, Chicago, University of Chicago Press, 1902, page 36. In economics, every policy carries a consequence. And the consequence of the loose monetary policy of the Second Bank of the United States was that America was introduced to her first experience with what is now called the boom-bust cycle. Galbraith tells us, quote, in 1816, the post-war boom was full on. There was especially active speculation in Western lands. The new bank joyously participated. And that quote was from Galbraith, page 77. The bank had the advantage over its competitors of a federal charter, plus the government's agreement to accept its notes in the payment of taxes. But the state banks were by no means left out of the game. It was still within their power to create money through fractional reserve banking and thus to further inflate the amount of the nation's circulating currency. Anxious to get in on this action, Pennsylvania chartered 37 new banks in 1817. That same year, Kentucky followed suit with 40 new charters. The total number of banks grew by 46% in just the first 2 years after the central bank was created. Any spot along the road, excuse me, that had, quote, a church, a tavern, or a blacksmith shop was deemed a suitable place for setting up a bank. And that quote was from Normal Angle, The Story of Money. New York Frederick A. Stokes Company, 1929, page 279. At the same time frame, the money supply was expanded by an additional $27.4 million, another taxpayer fleecing of over 40%. Jeez. These people have no accountability. That's why they're so bold. And with each cycle, if you will, just a side note here, their mindset is, oh yeah, we're not going to get caught. There's not going to be any accountability. And people are ignorant, so we'll just push the, you know, responsibility onto them. Nobody's going to know, and we can get away with murder, right? Wow. That's why I think accountability is so important because when you learn there is consequences and accountability, people are not going to do it again. Or they think twice about doing it again, right? Anyways, the first boom bust cycle. In the past, the effect of this inflationary process always had been the gradual evaporation of purchasing power and the continuous transfer of property from those who produced it to those who control the government and ran the banks. This time, however, the process took on a new twist. Gradualism was replaced by catastrophism. The monetary scientists, with their hands firmly on the controls of the money machine, now began to throw the levers, first one way and then the other. The expansion and then deliberate contraction of the money supply literally threw the nation into economic convulsions. Why wait for the apples to fall when the harvest can be hastened simply by shaking the tree? In 1818, the bank suddenly began to tighten its requirements for new loans and to call in as many of the old loans as possible. This contraction of the money supply was justified to the public then exactly as it is justified today. It was necessary, they said, to put the brakes on inflation. The fact that this was the same inflation the bank had helped to create in the first place seems to have gone unnoticed. There was no doubt that many bankers and politicians act in good faith in their attempt to bring under control the inflation they themselves have caused. Not everyone who benefits from the central bank mechanism fully understands it. Like Frankenstein, they create a monster without realizing they cannot control it. Their crime is one of stupidity, not malice. But stupidity is not a characteristic of the average banker, especially a central banker. And we must conclude that many of the monetary scientists are well aware of the monster's power for destruction. At best, they just doesn't care. They just don't care as long as they are safe. And at worst, they perceive that they are in the apple harvesting business. They deliberately tease and prod the monster in anticipation of his rampage through the village orchards. In the final analysis, of course, it is of little importance whether the shaking of the trees is out of innocence or malice. The end result is the same. My, how the apples do fall. The country's first experience with a deliberately created monetary contraction began in 1818 when the bank became concerned about his own ability to survive. Professor Rothbard says, starting in July 1818, the government and the BUS, Bank of the United States, began to see what dire straits they were in. The enormous inflation of money and credit, aggravated by the massive fraud, had put the BUS in danger of going under and illegally to maintain specie payments. Over the next year, the BUS began a series of enormous contractions, forced curtailment of loans, contractions of credit in the South and West. The contraction of money and credit swiftly brought to the United States its first widespread economic and financial depression. The first nationwide boom-bust cycle had arrived in the United States. The result of this contraction was a rash of defaults, bankruptcies of business and manufacturers, and a liquidation of unsound investments during the boom. And that quote was from Rothbard, Mystery, page 204 to 205. Also see Galbraith, page 77. The cycle is worsened by government interference. It is widely believed that panics, boom bust cycles, and depressions are caused by unbridled competition between banks, thus the need for government regulation. The truth is just the opposite. These disruptions in the free market are the result of government prevention of competition by the granting of monopolistic power to a central bank. In the absence of a monopoly, individuals' bank may operate in a fraudulent manner only to a limited extent and for a short period of time. Inevitably, they will be exposed by their more honest competitors and will be forced out of business. Yes, their depositors will be injured by the bankruptcy, but the damage will be limited to a relatively few and will occur only now and then. Even geographical regions may be hard hit on occasion, but it will not be a national tragedy with everyone brought to their knees. The overall economy will absorb the losses, the commerce at large will continue to prosper. Within an environment of prosperity, even those who have been injured by fraudulent banking would have a good chance for rapid recovery. But when a central bank is allowed to protect the fraudulent operators and to force all banks to function the same, the forces of competition can no longer dampen the effect. The expansion becomes universal and gigantic. And of course, so does the contraction. Except for the bankers and the politicians, everyone is injured at the same time. Depression is everywhere and recovery is long delayed. This is exactly what happened to the so-called Panic of 1819. In the documentary History of Banking and Currency, Herman Kruse writes, the bank, as the largest creditor to the state banks, had two alternatives. It could write off its debts, which of course would wipe out the stockholders' equity and result in bankruptcy, or it could force the state banks to meet their obligations, which would mean wholesale bankruptcy among state banks. There was no doubt about the choice. The pressure placed upon state banks deflated the economy drastically. And as the money supply wilted, the country sank into severe depression. And that quote was from Kruse, Volume 1, page 190 to 191. As historian William Gauge observed, the bank was saved and the people were ruined. And that quote was from William M. Gauge, A Short History of Paper Money and Banking in the United States. New York, Augustus M. Kelly, 1968, page 110. Competition between the national bank and the state banks during this period had been removed from the open field of the free market to the closed arena of politics. Free market competition had been replaced by government favoritism in the form of charters, which granted the right of monopoly. A federal charter was clearly better than one issued by the state, but the states fought back fiercely with what weapons they possessed, and one of those was the power to tax. Several states began to levy a tax on the paper notes issued by any bank doing business within their borders, which was not also locally chartered. The intent, although pretended to be the raising of state revenue, was really to put the federal bank out of business. The Supreme Court upholds the bank. When the bank refused to pay such a tax to the state of Maryland, the issue was taken to the Supreme Court in 1819 as the celebrated case of McCullough versus Maryland. The Chief Justice at that time was John Marshall, a leading Federalist and advocate of a strong centralized federal government. As was expected, the Marshall Court carefully tailored its decision to support the federal government's central bank. So, just a side note, the statement that courts are not supposed to be political is not really a true statement, is it? Because they will, whatever decision, especially like the Supreme Court, right? Whatever decision they make, they will, like here, it says carefully tailored. So they kind of know that they can't be political, but they carefully word it, writes the word very carefully, right? To sort of lean towards whatever political, I don't know if I'm making any sense, lean towards their political whatever decision. Anyways, just a thought. The narrow issue upon which the constitutionality of the bank was decided was not whether Congress had the power to directly or indirectly emit bills of credit or otherwise convert debt into money. If it had been the issue, the court would have been hard pressed to uphold the bank. For that not only is expressly prohibited by the Constitution, it is precisely what the bank had been doing all along, and everyone knew it. Instead, the court focused upon the narrow question of whether or not the bank was a necessary and proper means for Congress to execute any other constitutional powers it might have. From that perspective, it was unanimously held that the bank was indeed constitutional. Were the bank's paper notes the same as bills of credit? No, because they were backed by the credit of the bank, not the federal government. True, the bank created money and most of it was used by the government. Never mind all that. The Treasury did not print it, therefore, it was not government money. Was not the bank the same as an agency of government? No, because merely granting it a national monopoly and enforcing that monopoly with the power of the state does not necessarily make it state action. Furthermore, the states cannot tax the federal government or any of its instruments, including the Bank of the United States, because, as Marshall stated, quote, the power to tax is the power to destroy, end quote. Here was another end run toward the Constitution, executed this time by the very men who were assumed to be its most loyal defenders. The Supreme Court had spoken, but the court of public opinion had not yet disposed of the case. During the 1820s, popular sentiment shifted back to the laissez-faire and sound money principles espoused by the Jeffersonian Republicans. But since the Republican Party had by then abandoned those principles, a new coalition was formed, headed by Martin Van Buren and Andrew Jackson, to resurrect them. It was called the Democratic Party, and one of its agenda items was to abolish the Bank of the United States. After Jackson was elected to the presidency in 1828, he wasted no time in attempting to build congressional support for that goal. Nicholas Biddle. By this time, the bank had come under the direction of Nicholas Biddle, who was a formidable adversary to Jackson, not only because of the power of his position, but because of his strong will and sense of personal destiny. He was the archetype of the new Eastern establishment, wealthy, arrogant, ruthless, and brilliant. He had graduated from the University of Pennsylvania at the age of only 13. Oh my goodness. Wow, that's incredible. And as a young man entering business, had fully mastered the secret science of money. With the ability to control the flow of the nation's credit, Biddle soon became one of the most powerful men in America. This was brought out dramatically when he was asked by a Senate committee if his bank ever took advantage of his superior position over the state banks. He replied, "Never. There are very few banks which might not have been destroyed by an exertion of the powers of the bank. None has ever been injured." And that quote was from J.D. Richardson, a compilation of the messages and papers of the presidents, 1789 to 1908, Washington Bureau of National Literature and Art, 1908, Volume 2, page 581. As Jackson publicly noted a few months later, this was an admission that most of the state banks existed only at the pleasure of the Bank of the United States, and that, of course, meant at the pleasure of Mr. Biddle. The year was 1832. The bank's charter was good for another 4 years, but Biddle decided not to wait that long for Jackson to build his forces. He knew that the president was up for re-election, and he reasoned that as a candidate he would hesitate to be too controversial. To criticize the bank is one thing, but to come down squarely for its elimination altogether would surely cost him many votes. So Biddle requested Congress to grant an early renewal of the charter as a means of softening Jackson's campaign against it. The bill was backed by the Republicans led by Senator Henry Clay and was passed into law on July 3rd, just before the election campaigns began in earnest. Jackson overrides Congress. It was a brilliant strategy on Biddle's part, but it didn't work. Jackson decided to place his entire political career on the line for this one issue. And with perhaps the most passionate message ever delivered to Congress by any president before or since, he vetoed the measure. The president's biographer, Robert Remini, says, quote, "The veto message hit the nation like a tornado, for it not only cited constitutional arguments against recharter, supposedly the only reason for resorting to a veto, but political, social, economic, and nationalistic reasons as well." And that quote was from Robert V. Remini, The Life of Andrew Jackson, New York, Harper and Row, 1988, page 227 to 228. Jackson devoted most of his veto message to three general topics. Number one, the injustice that is inherent in granting a government sponsored monopoly to the bank. Two, the unconstitutionality of the bank, even if it were not unjust. And three, the danger to the country in having the bank heavily dominated by foreign investors. Regarding the injustice of a government-sponsored monopoly, he pointed out that the stock of the bank was owned only by the richest citizens of the country, and that since the sale of stock was limited to a chosen few with political influence, the common man not only is unfairly excluded from the opportunity to participate, but he is forced to pay for his banking services far more than they are worth. Unearned profits are bad enough when they are taken from one class of citizens and given to another. But it is even worse when the people receiving those benefits are not even citizens at all, but are in fact foreigners. Jackson said, quote, "It is not our own citizens only who are to receive the bounty of our government. More than 8 millions of the stock of this bank are held by foreigners. By this act, the American Republic proposes virtually to make them a present of some millions of dollars. It appears that more than a fourth part of the stock is held by foreigners, and the residue is held by a few hundred of our own citizens, chiefly of the richest class. For their benefit, does this act exclude the whole American people from competition in the purchase of this monopoly and dispose of it for many millions less than it is worth?" And that quote was from Cruz, page 22 and 23. Regarding the issue of constitutionality, He said that he was not bound by the previous decision of the Supreme Court because the president and the Congress had just as much right to decide for themselves whether or not a particular law is constitutional. This view, incidentally, was not novel at that time. It was only in relatively recent decades that people have begun to think of the Supreme Court as being specifically authorized to pass on this question. In fact, as Jackson correctly pointed out in his veto message, the founding fathers created a government with power divided between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, and that the purpose of this division was not merely to divvy up the chores, but to balance one branch against the other. The goal was not to make government efficient, but to deliberately make it inefficient. Each president and each legislator is morally bound, even by oath, to uphold the Constitution. If each of them does not have the power to decide in conscience what is constitutional, then taking an oath to uphold it has little meaning. The bank controlled by foreign investors. Regarding the danger to our national security, Jackson returned to the fact that the major portion of the bank's stockholders were foreigners. Even though foreign investors technically were not allowed to vote their shares, their financial power was so great that the American investors were clearly beholden to them and would likely follow their instructions. Jackson concluded, is there no danger to our liberty and independence in a bank that in its nature has so little to bind it to our country? Is there not cause to tremble for the purity of our elections in peace and for the independence of our country in war? Of the course which would be pursued by a bank almost wholly owned by the subjects of a foreign power and managed by those whose interests, if not affections, would run in the same direction, there can be no doubt. Controlling our currency, receiving our public monies, and holding thousands of our citizens' independence, it would be more formidable and dangerous than a naval and military power of the enemy. And that quote was from Cruz, page 26 and 27. Jackson saved the greatest passion of his argument for the end. Speaking now not to Congress, but to the voters at large, he said, quote, it is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. Distinctions in society will always exist under every just government. Equality of talents, of education, and of wealth cannot be produced by human institutions. In the full enjoyment of the gifts of heaven and the fruits of superior industry, economy, and virtue, every man is equally entitled to production by law. And when the laws undertake to add to these natural and just advantages artificial distinctions, to grant titles, gratuities, and exclusive privileges, to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society, the farmers, mechanics, and laborers, who have neither the time nor the means of securing like favors to themselves, have a right to complain of the injustice of their government. There are no necessary evils in government. Its evils exist only in its abuses. If it would confine itself to equal protection, and as heaven does its rains, shower its favor alike on the high and the low, the rich and the poor, it would be an unqualified blessing. In the act before me, there seems to be a wide and unnecessary departure from these just principles. And that quote was from IBIT, page 36 and 37. The veto did not defeat the bank. It was merely a declaration of war. The major battles were yet to come. Okay, we'll stop there for now. I hope you enjoyed that. A very interesting history there. We will continue part 2 next week. In the meantime, like I said, check out our other book clubs, check out our newsletters and podcasts and merch on YouTube, and come visit us in our healing center and check out our website. In the meantime, I hope you guys all have a great day, and I will see you next time. Okay, bye-bye now.